On May 24th, 2016, Blizzard Entertainment released Overwatch. At first, I didn't give the game much credence. But after seeing some gameplay videos on YouTube, and because it's a Blizzard game, I decided to give it a shot. While there are certain aspects of the game I don't like, overall I would say it's a robust competitive first-person shooter that has that Blizzard feel to it. And that got me thinking about earlier Blizzard games that I played. And one Blizzard game that I used to play a lot was Starcraft. I haven't beaten it until recently, so I thought I'd make a general overview video about this game. I do like to talk about video games after all, and talking about Starcraft is hard to resist. For each race in Starcraft there are 10 missions. So there are 10 missions for the Terrans, 10 missions for the Zerg, and 10 missions for the Protoss. You can do each subsection out of order, though the game will prompt you to do it in order for the full story timeline. When you start a mission, you are taken to a briefing screen in which various characters will talk to each other. You'll also get a mission objective that you'll have to complete in order to complete the level. All exposition in Starcraft is done through these briefing sections, with occasional cutscenes after you complete a mission. There isn't a lot of variety in the missions. Usually they boil down to defeat the enemy, bring X to Y, defend this, etc.
Greetings, Commander. Receiving incoming transmission.
The power of that which is yet unborn, for the swirling images was most dire. The cerebrate that we thought we had killed has arisen and
While there isn't a lot of variety in the mission objective, it's enough to keep you engaged as you'll have many things to deal with in-game that you won't even notice the objective. The whole campaign took me about 30 hours or so to complete, and you can always replay each mission afterwards to try and beat your best time in order to try out new strategies. And when you're done with the campaign, you can try to create your own maps using the Include Star Edit program. As was customary back then, most PC games came with the tools that the developers used to make the game. Starcraft was no exception. While I haven't dabbled into it, you can rest assured that if you want to make your own maps, there is no shortage of online tutorials to help you get started. To this very day, there are still people making new maps for Starcraft. And then there's the multiplayer, either using LAN or the then new Battle.net service, if you want to test your skills against players around the world. Multiplayer in itself is a separate animal. Starcraft uses 2D sprite elements to represent units and objects in-game. Character portraits use pre-rendered 3D models during mission briefings and in-game. I find that the 2D sprite artwork lends itself well to the game because even though it's limited by the standards of the era, you can distinguish each unit from each other and they all have unique animations. It lends itself well to the art direction of the game, which is sort of this high-tech, low-tech kind of universe, where characters have technology but there's always instances where there's low-tech, whether it be scans on the portrait screens or an old-looking type of armor and such that you can see throughout the map artwork. It reminds me of the Star Wars universe, how even though there's lightsabers and warp speed, part of the universe looks like it's been there a long time. The lived-in universe that Starcraft takes some cues from. You may have noticed that while playing the game, the characters' mouth movements aren't in sync to what they are actually saying. While this may put you off, I find it endearing as it adds some charm to the game. Blizzard must have thought so too, because for Starcraft Remastered they upgraded the character portrait art, but they didn't add any lip-syncing whatsoever.
From Alpha Squadron flagship NORAD 2. We crash landed and are being hit hard by the Zerg. Request immediate backup from anyone receiving this signal.
Because there's no lip-syncing or character emotions, the entire character performance is done through the voices. And let me tell you, the acting in this game is excellent. When I first played this game, one of the first things that I noticed was the acting. Every actor gives a believable performance for their character, that you really feel the emotion when something happens in the story. It's quite amazing what the cast and directors were able to accomplish in 1998, considering that voicing characters in video games was just starting to become a thing. Not only do the actors who voice story characters do a good job, but even the actors who voice the units, some of whom were Blizzard employees at the time, do a fine job.
Seems our data disks didn't hold weapon designs after all. Lieutenant Kerrigan will explain.
You all know that the Confederates run a program for psychically gifted humans, training them to be ghosts. Those running the program found that the Zerg are attuned to the psychic emanations of ghosts.
So the Zerg are here for you, darling? This keeps getting better and better.
Shut up.
Cerebrate, you watched over me during my incubation, and I am grateful to you. It is my wish that you continue your vigil, so that I might strengthen my powers to better aid the Swarm. I have been unable to access the totality of my latent powers, and as such, I would like to infiltrate a Terran science vessel and uncover the secrets of their abandoned ghost projects. If I can learn more about their mental conditioning, I can undo the damage their tinkering scientists have done to my mind.
Though you be the favored servant of the Overmind, you would do well to remember that you are just a servant. You know of our grand mission, Kerrigan. Would you put your personal whims before the will of the Overmind?
Do not cross me, Zaz. I will do as I see fit.
Greetings, Executor, and greetings to you, Tacitor. I am overjoyed to see you both return home in this dark hour. The Zerg have redoubled their efforts, and it seems...
It can't be. The Executor told me of how you fell before the Zerg. How is it that you live and breathe?
Well, after my unfortunate defeat, my ruined body was recovered by our brethren. I now reside within the cold robotic shell of a Dragoon.
Old friend, would that this never came to pass.
Nonsense! There is no shame in defeat, so long as the spirit is unconquered, and I am still able to serve Aya to a degree. But enough of this. There is much you...
They do such a good job that even after you finish StarCraft, you'll find yourself remembering the performances for years to come.
Destination?
Search complete.
Somebody call for an exterminator?
Let's wax these critters.
Stay cool, Commander. Remember the plan. The Zerg are to remain unharmed.
Comlink online. Confirmed. Acknowledged HQ. Confirmed.
Colossus upgrade unit. Commencing lock time. For vengeance. Receiving. Instructions.
Upgrade complete.
I read you. Affirmative. Roger that.
Upgrade complete.
Somebody call for an exterminator? I'm here.
Reporting for duty.
Even though units always say something when you interact with them, I never got tired of hearing them speak. What's a good video game without a good soundtrack? Composed by Derek Dew, Jason Hayes, Glenn Stafford, and Tracy W. Bush, StarCraft's soundtrack is very good in my opinion. When you first start the campaign, you hear the great Terran theme that most everybody knows when playing StarCraft.
Go, go, go. Outstanding. Go, go, go. Let's move. Go, go, go. Outstanding. Rock and roll. Let's move. Rock and roll. Go, go, go. Outstanding. Go, go, go. Let's move. Rock and roll. Let's move.
And when you're playing the campaign, you'll find that the music is in sync with the actions that you are doing. It adds a level of energy to the game, especially as your colony grows. It's a memorable soundtrack that you will not soon forget. The sound effects are excellent as well. Every unit has a unique sound effect, and they are recognizable after you start to play, and you'll know which one is attacking you just by the sound they make. There's a mix of high technology for the Protoss and the Terrans, and unique organic type sounds for the Zerg.
Not enough minerals.
Affirmative.
Standing by. Go, go, go. Outstanding. Go, go, go. Rock and roll.
We have you on visual. Excellent. Affirmative, sir. Excellent.
Let's move. Go, go, go.
Your forces are under attack.
Let's move.
Greetings, Command. Commencing. Let's roll. Excellent.
The cutscenes in this game are something else. While video games today put a lot of resources into the story cutscenes, keeping with the era that Starcraft was released, the cutscenes are low key, meaning that the cutscenes in the game don't really have any campaign story elements to them. Whether you sort them in order or out of order, they don't really correspond to the actions of the campaign. While this may seem like an odd choice, I believe it was the right choice, as cutscenes show more of the world of Starcraft rather than focus on the story. As such, they have aged quite well. Even though what was groundbreaking for the time pales in comparison to the technology of today, the cutscenes reinforce StarCraft's high-tech, low-tech, lived-in world. It gives them an art house quality to them that is unique to this game.
What you got for me out there, Joey Ray?
We got Terra for sure. I don't know about the rest. We got a big old buttload of floating debris out here. We hit pay dirt this time for sure.
The background art looks really good as well. Even at just 640 by 480, Blizzard really used all of the colors that they could to bring this world to life. I will start off the gameplay discussion by talking about StarCraft's three main races, the Terrans, the Protoss, and the Zerg. The Terrans are the race that you will get acquainted with when you first start playing the campaign in StarCraft, unless you do the campaign out of order. They are the easiest to pick up and start playing with because their tech tree isn't as complicated as the Zerg or the Protoss. However, what they lack in depth, they make up for versatility. For instance, the basic combat unit of the Terrans, the Space Marine, can attack both air and ground units. Whereas the basic Protoss unit, the Zila, and the basic Zerg unit, the Zerglin, can only attack ground unit.
Vengeance. Commencing for vengeance. Initiating. For vengeance. Confirmed. Lothari. Initiating. Confirmed.
Because their tech tree isn't as deep as the Zerg or the Protoss, this allows the player to get up and running quicker, as they can build prerequisite buildings faster than the other two races. As an example, for the Zerg to upgrade their flyer units, you first have to upgrade your main base, and you have to build a Zerg Spire, which takes more time, while the Terrans have to build 2 additional units for this. Similarly, the Protoss also have multi-flyer types units, which also contributes to wait time. Due to the Terran's tech tree not being as deep, your strategy can be limiting as your defensive units aren't as granular, so you have to come up with ingenious ways of defending. For example, Protoss turrets attack both land and air units, and Terran turrets only attack air units. Similarly, the Zerg have 2 sets of turrets, one type that only attack air units, and one type that only can attack land units. Another difference between the Terrans and the other two races is the movement restrictions you have when placing buildings, meaning that the Zerg and the Protoss have movement restrictions. The Zerg can only build buildings on the ground that the Zerg have already built upon. The only building that isn't restricted to this is the Zerg hatchery. And once you have the Zerg hatchery built, you have to build more buildings to extend your colony reach. So the more buildings you build next to each other, the longer your reach becomes. Similarly, the Protoss can only build buildings within the radius of the pylon. When you click on the pylon, you'll see a highlight of the area that you can build the building in. If there's an area that you want to build a building in, but it's not highlighted by the Protoss pylon, you'll have to build another pylon to build in that area. The Terran, on the other hand, have no such movement restriction as they can build buildings wherever they please, which adds a different element to your defensive strategy when choosing the Terrans. If you play video games for a while, you might have heard somebody say that the Zerg are a rush race, but what does that mean exactly? Simply put, the Zerg have the least amount of wait time for building buildings and units in comparison to the Protoss or the Terrans. This allows them to overwhelm their opponent early in the match. Because of this, Zerg units are generally weaker than their Terran and Protoss counterparts. What they lack in power, though, they make up in speed. It's possible to build multiple Zerg units quicker than it is to build Terran or Protoss units. Protoss and Terran units are generally produced one at a time at their designated building. The Zerg, on the other hand, being an organic race, have larvae produced at the Zerg hatchery, and the larvae count increases at certain intervals. Players can wait until 5 or more larvae are produced and select them en masse, and then choose what unit they want, and the larvae will turn into eggs, and they all morph together at the same time. When defending, if the enemy does attack, you can easily build 10 Hydralisks or Zerglings very quickly, while Protoss and Terran attack units are built one at a time. Last but not least is the Protoss. Out of the 3 playable races, the Protoss have perhaps the most depth in their tech tree. If you've ever heard the phrase, "there's more than one way to skin a cat," that definitely applies to the Protoss. While the Zerg and Terrans have set units that do a certain thing, there's not a whole lot of room for experimentation with these two races. The Protoss, on the other hand, are perhaps the most granular, which allows for different types of strategies that neither the Zerg nor the Terrans can use. As an example, the Terrans have 2 flyer types, the Wraiths and the Battlecruisers. The Zerg also have only 2 flyer types, the Mulisks and the Guardians. The Protoss, on the other hand, have 3 flyers, Scouts, Carriers, and Arbiters. The Terran Wraiths can cloak, do damage to both air and ground units, but can do a lot more damage to the air units. The Battlecruiser can attack both land and air units and does an equal amount of damage to both, i.e. a lot. The Zerg Mulisk can attack air and land units in an attack pattern, but doesn't do a ton of damage. The Guardian, on the other hand, can deal massive amounts of damage to land units from a far off distance, but is slow and can attack air units, making escape more difficult. The Protoss flyers, on the other hand, have more diversity in their attack. The Scout is like the Wraith, The carrier builds small ships to swarm the enemy, and the arbiter can cloak enemies in its vicinity but is weak otherwise. This can change the strategy because as a Terran and a Zerg, you only have two choices as to which flyers you'll want to use. But because the Protoss have 3 flyers with varying ability, you'll have to think quick as to which aerial strategy will be the best as resources are limited. There are other similarities between the other races and the Protoss, and taking advantage of those strategies goes a long way into achieving victory. Believe it or not, one of the biggest challenges when playing StarCraft is your ability to manage resources effectively. It may seem trivial, but resource gathering is perhaps the most important aspect of StarCraft if you want to achieve victory. Remember that resources are limited, and every unit and building in the game costs resources. Run out of resources and you won't be able to build anything anymore, and you'll be more vulnerable to being attacked by the opponent. With resources being important and limited, how do you deal with resource management? One way to deal with resource management is to build what you need to build starting early on. That way, when you need to build additional units, you already have the basics done. Another way to deal with resource management is to monitor your starting supply of Vespene gas and crystals, and when you run low, explore the map to find new resources. For the longest time, I did not do this and thus would not win very often. But finding secondary sources of resources in StarCraft is beneficial to your colony as you can farm resources faster. The downside is that you have to provide proper defensive measures for every new resource that you find unless you want to become someone else's really quickly. Another observation that you'll make relatively quickly is at the beginning of the match, you'll be more focused on harvesting crystals, as building basic buildings and units cost crystal, and later as you finish up building all the upgrades and basic units, the more advanced units cost Vespene gas as well, so you want to keep track of your Vespene gas supply periodically. Since resources are limited, you'll have to find strategies to have less units perish and less buildings demolished, as the more units you have to rebuild means that you have to use more resources. Next up is the defensive strategies. If you watch or play any type of sport, you'll have no doubt heard the phrase a good offense is a good defense or something similar to that. This applies to StarCraft as well. I can't begin to say how many times I thought I had a good offense, but my defense was lacking, which allowed the enemy to demolish my entire base in a matter of minutes due to them exploiting a loophole that I didn't account for. If this has happened to you, then you know that to have an offense that can carry the match, you need a good defense that can withstand all types of enemy attacks. How do you know how to build a good defense, however? Well, there are a lot of factors at play that you won't always know when starting a game. One is the terrain, which if you explore, you'll get a good idea of where the enemy can come from. The second is the enemy behavior and what strategies they employ to take control, which you won't always know in advance. Because of this, you'll have to find a defensive strategy that can cover the bases but allow for expandability. For example, you can start building defensive measures to defend against land units and then step it up to airborne units. Another strategy that I use is that if I'm waiting for units to be built, I'll build defensive type buildings in the downtime. I find that until the enemy attacks and I can successfully quell the attack, that's when I know what the enemy might do next, so I adjust accordingly. Defensive measures are ever evolving and you'll always have to be ready at any time to buff your defense. Next up is mouse clicks and hotkeys. An overlooked aspect of StarCraft is the mouse clicking, I believe. It sounds weird, but it's true because the mouse clicks are the main way of performing actions in StarCraft. As you play more and more, you'll come to realize that sometimes you try to click a unit and you'll either misclick because the unit's hitbox is too small, or they move really fast, or because the unit starts going in another direction. To mitigate this, you'll have to learn the art of clicking only when necessary, as well as the art of keeping your units together, so that when you need someone, they're easily accessible. It takes a lot of practice to know how far to move units, which units to move first, which units to move back, and such. You'll even see players select a group of units that are mixed, keeping certain units in the back and only bringing them out at an opportune time. Combined with the mouse is the hotkeys, which I haven't used very much during my playthrough, but you'll have to learn how to use them effectively if you want to reach a high skill level. Hotkeys allow you to do all sorts of things, such as select a group of units, only one unit, and things like that. You may be wondering how you're going to do all this stuff in the allotted time. Well, that's where the importance of always being proactive comes in. For the longest time, while my units or buildings were being built, I would rest idle. However, I would fail at the campaign many times because of this, and I could never really figure out why. That is, until I watched Master KD on YouTube do a playthrough of the entire campaign. And what I noticed the entire time while watching was that they kept using their resources, even when waiting for units to get ready, buildings to be built, and the like. In other words, they were never idle. And that brings up another key strategy point: you should never be idle in StarCraft. It's okay at the beginning of the match due to the low amount of crystals and Vespene gas that you have harvested. However, as you gain more resources, you can spend those resources on useful additions to your base. For instance, you can always build more supply depots or the equivalencies. Since you'll always be going for max capacity, the more supply depots you build, the more units you can produce, instead of waiting for the capacity full dialogue. You can build defensive units and do upgrades, which is always good to have. And the list goes on and on. This will all help you ensure a victory in the long run of the match. The last thing I want to touch upon is the fun factor. So you may be wondering, after hearing me talk about StarCraft's gameplay for the last little while, is StarCraft a fun game? Well, that depends on a couple of things. StarCraft isn't the type of game that you can pick up and play and learn in one sitting. Although I find it relatively simple to get into, it's one of those games that's simple to get into but hard to master. It's one of those games where you'll fail a lot before you see any sort of success. And even after you find success, you'll still fail occasionally and have to learn what you did wrong. But throughout all those games that you'll be playing and all those mistakes that you'll make, you'll start to learn what went wrong, what to do right next time, and what to learn the next time that you play. And only once you start doing this will you start seeing the fun factor in StarCraft. Once you get a rhythm going, you start to see the addictive factor which players first discovered some 20 years ago. So if you want to play a strategic game, StarCraft isn't a bad place to start. StarCraft was originally released on March 31st, 1998. It is essentially a 21-year-old game at this point. As such, there will be some additional work to get it to work on the modern operating systems. First, let's talk about the easiest way to play StarCraft today. In March of 2017, Blizzard first announced Starcraft Remastered. As such, they decided to make the original StarCraft and StarCraft Brood War free for everyone. The only requirement for this is that you need a Battle.net account, which you may not already have. So the easiest way to play it today is to sign up for a Battle.net account and install it from the launcher. If you want to play the original game, however, that's where things get interesting. Thankfully, because StarCraft was a very popular game, loose CD copies are easy to come across on places like eBay. Be warned that if you buy it used, make sure that it comes with the CD key, because the installer will ask you for that key when you install it. If you want to install Brood War from the original CD, you won't need a CD key because Brood War is an expansion to the original StarCraft. It requires the original game to be installed first, so once you install StarCraft, you can also install Brood War. All the footage that I captured for this video was captured on my laptop running Windows 10. In my case, I didn't have to change the compatibility settings for it to run, though your mileage may vary. Originally, StarCraft required the CD to be in the drive for it to run. Since most computers these days don't have DVD drives built in, you'll have to make an ISO of the CD by, for example, using a USB CD drive. And then you'll have to use the built-in Windows 10 CD drive emulator to mount the ISO file. To create the ISO file, I used Info Recorder. For earlier versions of Windows starting with XP, you'll need to download the CD-ROM drive emulator to do this, as these versions of Windows don't have an emulator installed by default. I used Daemon Tools Line Windows XP for this. Versions of Windows earlier than XP will require the original CD to be in the drive, so I suggest you make a backup of the game and use that. As far as I can tell, the only CD copy protection is for the disc to be inserted to play, so backup should work just fine. You may be wondering why you have to do this. Well, Blizzard actually released a patch of it about 10 years ago, I believe it's version 1.68, that removed the CD requirement. However, since the game is free now, the patch is seemingly gone from their official StarCraft support page, and I couldn't find it on any other website. If you're able to find it, then you can patch the game and forgo all of what I just said. Another concern is multiplayer. I installed version 1.0 on my laptop, and installing Brood War upgrades the game to version 1.5. Since this version is way out of date, you won't be able to play any multiplayer, as multiplayer requires all players to have the same version installed. Even when I tried to launch the Battle.net portion of the multiplayer, I was prompted to install the Battle.net client on my computer to play. So if you foresee yourself playing a lot of multiplayer, then you have no choice but to install StarCraft from the Battle.net client. If you're just playing the campaign or custom games against the AI, then it doesn't matter which version of StarCraft you use, as I did for this video. The last concern is StarEdit. Recently, StarEdit was deprecated in favor of SCM Draft 2. What this means is that if you make maps in StarEdit, you'll have to switch to SCM Draft 2 or a similar map editor. Whether you can convert existing maps made in StarEdit over to SCM Draft 2 or another map editor, I have no idea. You'll have to do some additional research yourself to figure that out. I haven't talked about Starcraft Remastered yet, so I'll talk about it now. Currently, at the time of recording, Starcraft Remastered costs around $19 Canadian on the Blizzard store, or your country's equivalent. At that price, should you consider buying it when you can play the original for free? Well, Starcraft Remastered updates the visuals and adds support for modern matchmaking systems. Other than that, all of the quirks of the original are still there, so it's not a full-on remake. Personally, I've only played some of the campaign missions in Starcraft Remastered. From what I played though, it felt just like the original StarCraft. As such, I don't think you're missing a lot in terms of gameplay if you decide not to upgrade. Though if you want to play the game at a native 1080p or 4K, then you have no choice but to purchase the upgrade. It'll also make recording your matches easier should you choose to play multiplayer. At the end of the day, it's up to you if you want to purchase the upgrade to Remastered. For me, Starcraft is a game unlike any other game that I had played up until then. Being used to platformers or FPSs with the occasional RPG, Starcraft changed my perception of what a game could be. No longer was a video game just about clearing a level, getting the most kills in deathmatch, or leveling up, but one about strategic planning and using a variety of tactics to defeat your opponent. Starcraft made me want to play games in different genres, not just what I was used to. Warcraft and Diablo put Blizzard on the map, but Starcraft arguably launched them into the stratosphere. Revisiting Starcraft reminds me of a time when the internet was but a dream, and all we had was our great desktop towers running Windows 98 and a mouse that didn't even have a scroll wheel. We'd open up our CD drives, insert Starcraft, and mine crystals until the early hours of the morning. Nonetheless, Starcraft is still a good game, even today. So what are you waiting for? If you've never played Starcraft before, go install it right now. And if you played Starcraft before, play it again. To quote Ana, a character from Overwatch,
"You made the right decision."
Captain Raynor, I finished scouting out the area and... You pig!
What? I haven't even said anything to you yet.
Yeah, but you were thinking it.
Oh, yeah. You're a telepath. Look, let's just get on with this, okay?
Right.